Welcome to the Daily Dawg Podcast. Today is Thursday, January 1st of 2026. It is the new year, and we start the new year off just the way God intended with a Georgia football game. And not just any football game, but this is a quarterfinal playoff matchup against Ole Miss. This is a rematch, of course, of our Ole Miss game earlier in the season, SEC versus SEC game here in this quarterfinal matchup, which is a little disappointing and a little unfair. I mean, maybe unfair is not the right word. That's how the seedings came out. But I just wish that we had the opportunity to play a more interesting and dynamic game than a repeat of a game we've already seen. And we've already seen two other repeats so far in the college football playoff. In our last podcast, we talked a little bit about the playoffs already, and I've already shared my opinion that, now that we're down to this final 8, I think we actually do have pretty much 8 teams, most of whom probably had a legitimate chance to actually make their way through and contend for the national championship. I would say the two weakest teams at the bottom, obviously Alabama and Ole Miss, are the 9 and 10 seeds. Ole Miss is the 6 seed and Alabama is the 9 seed. Actually, Miami is the 10 seed. But Ole Miss is actually probably the team I've said would have the least chance of making it to the college football final. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a scary game, and they might not be able to beat us. Rematches are always tricky, and obviously it was a relatively close game last time. Georgia needed a 17-point or a 17-0 fourth quarter where they held Ole Miss to about 19 yards or so total in the quarter while racking up 17 points just to pull out the 8-point victory against Ole Miss. So, certainly a game that we should look at with a little bit of trepidation, be a little bit concerned as we head towards it, not just overconfident. However, Georgia's been playing excellent football and was probably the third most likely team, according to media personality, talking heads, fans, and betting odds, Vegas betting odds alike, to win this playoff. And the first most likely team is now out, thanks to Miami. Ohio State has bowed out of the playoff. So also a little concerning about that. While that might be exciting, we might feel like our path is a little easier. So now we know who we will play. If we win tonight and advance to the semifinals, we know we'll be playing Miami. And so that's an exciting game, interesting game, and a game probably a lot of people both maybe were looking forward to or possibly feared, because obviously we would be reuniting on the field with Carson Beck, and it would be Carson Beck playing his old team Georgia with his new team Miami, and the winner goes on to the finals of the college football championship, has a chance to play for the national championship. So that will be an interesting and dramatic game. But first we have to get there, right? And that means we have to beat Ole Miss. But first, let me just say a couple words again about the playoff. I had said in the previous podcast that the 8-team playoff, my preference would be, if we needed to expand it from 4 teams, and I was actually pretty happy with 4 teams, that I would have taken an 8-team playoff. And like I said, I think we're down to 8 teams that when you look at it, these are all teams that are pretty legitimate chance to play for, beat each other, and compete for the national championship. I think Ole Miss is probably the weakest of those, and not because they can't beat us, but because, as I mentioned also in the previous podcast, defense has really ruled the day in the last 5 years of this college football playoff. The last 5 national champions have either been the number 1 overall defensive team in the country, depending on which metrics you're looking at, but we're talking mostly about points allowed and total yardage and some other defensive metrics. But the last 5 national champions, which includes 2 Georgia national championships, right? 2021 and 2022. And then you've got Michigan in 2023 and Ohio State in 24. I guess I went all the way back to Alabama on that one in 2020, because we haven't gotten to the 2025 national championship. So you have Alabama in 20, Georgia in 21 and 22, Michigan in 23, and Ohio State in 24. All 5 of those champions were either the number 1 defensive team in the country by defensive metrics, or they were the best defensive team in the playoff. So defense, once you get to the playoff, has been a big determiner of who's going to win the national championship. Obviously, you can't win without some offense, and most of those teams have been pretty good offensively. But the variation in how good they were offensively is much more dramatic than the variation in the defensive metrics. The defensive metrics have been pretty persistent. Another thing I mentioned in the previous podcast was that so far this year and so far in the early playoff, games that we saw in the first round, defense has, and we saw this also with I alluded to the Big Ten championship game and even the SEC championship game. Yes, Georgia ended up blowing out Alabama 28-7, but it was a very defensive-minded game. Neither team got over 350 yards in the game of total offense, and though Georgia put up 28 points, of course, we had some short fields that helped contribute that. We had a nice long punt return, we had an interception return, and we had a block punt that set us up deep inside Alabama's territory. So a lot of the effort was done on the defensive and special team side of the ball in that game. Also, you look at even Georgia's game against Texas, where we won 35-10. That was a 14-10 game late in the third quarter, going into the fourth quarter. It had been a real defensive struggle, with Georgia largely controlling the game, but then able to open up a 21-point fourth quarter, a little bit like the game against Ole Miss, where Georgia was able to completely shut down the Longhorns the rest of the way while putting up some offense and putting some points on the board and getting the Longhorns into a desperation situation. So, I think that thus far we've just seen that when the better teams, you even look at the beginning of the season, and yes, it was early in the season. Neither team was really who they became by later in the season. Texas now just beat Michigan yesterday in their bowl game and put 40 points on the board. And Arch Manning had a big game leading Texas to the victory over Michigan. And defense was not the name of the day. That was like a 42-28 score. So, but for most of this season, the big games against the heavyweight teams, Indiana, Ohio State, and the Big Ten championship game, a lot of these other games, we've seen defense really be a determining factor. Big 12, I mentioned the Big 12 championship game. BYU ended up losing to Texas Tech, 35-7, 34-7, but that was also a game that was like a 13-7 game in the third quarter, and defensive turnovers by BYU, somewhat created by Texas Tech, led to Texas Tech getting short fields, quick scores, and blowing that game out as it went. So I think defense is still going to be a key indicator, and all of the 8 teams that we have remaining in this playoff, or we had remaining coming into last night, Ohio State, Indiana, Texas Tech, Miami, Georgia, Oregon, Alabama, and Ole Miss, 7 of those 8 teams are in the top 13 in the country in defensive metrics, and the worst of those being Alabama. Alabama is ranked 13th in scoring defense and 13th in total defense or yardage allowed. But when you look at Ohio State, they were number 1 in both. Indiana is number 2 and number 4 in those categories. Texas Tech 3 in both. Miami came into this game, again, not surprising to see Miami put up a big defensive game against Ohio State. They came into the game 6th in scoring defense, 11th in total defense. Georgia comes in 9th and 12th, 9th in scoring defense and 12th in total defense. Oregon is 10 and 8. And like I said, Alabama's 13 in both. So the outlier there is Ole Miss. Ole Miss is only 22nd in the country in scoring defense. So they outperform their total defense, which is 40th in the country. Overall, they're trending in the 30s, in terms of their defensive metrics. And there are other metrics too, if you look across the board. So that's why I think Ole Miss, even if they were able to win the game today and beat Georgia, I don't think they're going to win the national championship. I would question whether they would even advance beyond Miami and win, because they're going to have to face too many teams that play good defense, and they're a little bit more of a one-sided team. While they are in the top 2 in the country in total offense and top 10 in the country in offense scored, they don't play enough defense to complement that. And all of the teams that are in the playoff of the final 8 were all teams, including Ohio State, that had shown during the year that they could play top 10, top 15 defense while also having a top 25, top 30 or better offense. And so Ole Miss is the outlier there. So does that mean we're going to win the game against Ole Miss? Well, I do think we're going to win the game today against Ole Miss, but I think that's for different reasons. I think that part of it is involved in where they are defensively. Let me take a moment before we jump into breaking down the Georgia-Ole Miss game and just say a few more things about the Ohio State-Miami game. I thought it was a fascinating game and certainly important to watch as Georgia fans and as a podcaster focused on bringing you information and breakdowns about Georgia. I felt it's important to look at that Ohio State-Miami game because the winner of that game is who we hope and expect and are expecting to hopefully play on January 8th, next week, a week from today. So what did we see? We saw a defensive battle, and we saw that Ohio State, despite being this dominant number one wire-to-wire, well, not wire-to-wire. Actually, Texas started the season number one, and Ohio State was number three. But once Ohio State won that defensive slog, 14-7, in the Horseshoe up in Ohio, they took over the number one ranking, and they've held it all the way through until they lost to Indiana. And then Indiana took over that number one ranking. And so we've heard a lot of crowing from the Big Ten. And, rightfully so, because the Big Ten does have three elite teams up in the top of the rankings and in the playoff this year. They had number one, Indiana, coming into this playoff, number two, Ohio State, and number five, Oregon. So that is pretty high cotton there. Now, I think the real issue, though, that may have plagued Ohio State, and the question is always when you see now Ohio State goes 12-0 on the regular season, and then they lose back-to-back games to kind of put a little bit of a thud on the end of their season, right? It's hard to remember the 12 wins that you had when you closed with two losses, and especially the two biggest games, right? You had a chance to win, if you're Ohio State, the Big 12 championship. You fell flat and gave that to Indiana. And then you had a chance to win in the playoff and advance and give yourself a chance to defend the national championship, and that fell flat against Miami. Again, I was a little surprised. I didn't get a chance to talk to you guys about that, but I saw the line. This was actually the biggest line from Vegas of all of these playoff games. Miami came into the game as a 9.5-point underdog. And I'd been telling people that I've been talking to, friends and family and people I've been around during the holidays, that the most surprising thing I saw coming into this final 8 playoff teams and looking at these quarterfinal matchups was that Ohio State was such a big favorite. When that game, I watched the Texas A&M and Miami game with quite a bit of interest, and it was a good game and it was compelling, but it certainly was not a score fest, right? A 10-3 game that Miami was able to eke out, and both teams made a lot of mistakes. But I did say after that game on our podcast when we talked about it that to me, it showed that either of those teams were dangerous and could advance because, especially Miami, because we already know Miami's put up a lot of points during the season and they've been defensively strong against a very weak ACC. But theoretically, they came into the season with like Ruben Baines and other guys on their team that people said this is a really elite, capable defense with a fierce pass rush. And early in the season, that was an idea that propelled Miami up to the number 2, number 3 spot in the rankings as they won that game early against Notre Dame, as they beat South Florida, as they beat Florida State, as they beat Florida. They were getting a lot of love. Obviously, they lost 2 games to SMU and to Louisville. Nobody is excited about either of those teams as elite teams, so really tarnished Miami's image a little bit. But unlike Notre Dame, who I'm sure in some way is trying to find, I'm sure Notre Dame fans are still sitting there scratching their head going, see, Miami beat Ohio State and they barely beat them. We would have killed them. I'm sure in the theoretical bowl that Notre Dame keeps wanting to play, they think they would do much better than what Miami's already done. And Miami winning doesn't validate Miami's choice. We've already talked about that. The choice was fair. The choice was reasonable. You put yourself in a position where you're a 10-2 or a 9-3 team and you got a couple losses and you're down near the bottom of the seedings as far as the seedings that are going to make it into the playoff. There's just not that much room for argument. So the fact that Miami has won its first 2 games doesn't validate that they got in over Notre Dame, but it certainly does show that they are worthy of being in this playoff. They've beaten a good Texas A&M team on the road, and now they've beaten the presumptive number 1 team throughout the season, the team with the best overall metrics and stats all throughout the season, and team that was still, even after losing to Indiana and falling down to the 2 seed, was still the odds on in Vegas and media favorite and in many cases fan favorite. Although the fan vote actually has sort of swung. Georgia's actually done well in the fan vote too. But I think one thing, though, that just strikes me is that Ohio State schedule did not prepare them for, when you see this disparity that Ohio State played so many games in which they dominated, they had the best overall defensive points allowed and defensive metrics that anybody's had in about 15 years, even better than the Georgia 2021 team, which was considered a generationally great defense. And I didn't hear everybody quite saying the same thing. I mean, there's a lot of love for this Ohio State defense and a belief that these are really a legit team and good players, but I hadn't heard people talking about the Ohio State team as a generationally good defense, but they had generationally good stats. And I think we can see now that Ohio State, and I'm not saying they were a fraud. I think they really are a great team. I think they are talented, and I think they could have just as easily played better, won this game and advanced, and maybe even defended and won the national title, back-to-back national title. I think they had the talent to be back-to-back national champions. But being back-to-back champion is really hard. That's why it happens so rarely, and we're proud that it happens rarely, and we were able to accomplish that as Georgia fans. But we're also just know that that's an uncommon feat. And it's even harder probably in today's world, because even though you might get a favorable schedule like Ohio State did and walk your way through a schedule and put yourself in the old bowl and pole era that I keep referencing throughout the season, in the old bowl and pole era, Ohio State would have proceeded right to the Rose Bowl, potentially. I mean, you'd have this problem with Indiana also being undefeated, but let's just leave that out for the moment. Let's just say they went undefeated. They were the only undefeated Big Ten team. They would have gone straight to the Rose Bowl, played whatever Pac-12 team made it, whether it was the number 18 team, an unranked team, or a number 2 team in the country. Either way, that's who they would have played in the bowl and pole era, and we would have been left to look at number 1 undefeated Ohio State having won that bowl game, potentially even against an overmatched team from the Pac-12. And we would have looked at that and said, well, okay, and they might have ended up as the national champion. Even that was difficult, but that was much easier than what you have to do today. Today, you can still get that favorable schedule, have your 12-0, but you see right now what's happened to Ohio State. They had the talent, they had the capability, but when pushed when they played the best teams they played this season, they lost both games. They didn't get embarrassed. I mean, Miami, this could have been worse. It was a 10-point loss, one of the worst losses they've seen in a little bit, or certainly the worst loss of this year. Their only other loss was a 3-point loss to Indiana. So both games were close. Both games were tight. It was 17-14 Miami late in the game, and Miami was able to put up another score, stretch out the lead, and hold on to it. So it was hardly a blowout, although it could have been. Miami certainly played well enough to have actually beaten Ohio State by even more. Ohio State put up enough fight that they could have actually even won this game as well. So I think, again, the key point here is it's really going to be difficult to see back-to-back national champions or teams just have that sort of dynastic run, at least. And if you think of a dynasty as just making a high seed in a playoff year in and year out, then maybe so. But if you're talking about running through this tournament year in and year out and winning it back-to-back national championships, I just don't think you're going to see that very much because you're playing too many good teams. Miami may not be the best team in the country. They may not win the national championship. We certainly hope they don't, because that would mean they beat us or we didn't even advance to play them. So obviously we don't want to see Miami win the national championship. That's the spot we want. But again, Miami has demonstrated that they could lose to Louisville, they could lose to SMU in the regular season, they could beat Notre Dame, they could beat other top teams. Now they've beaten Texas A&M on the road, and now they've beaten Ohio State. So the simple truth is Miami has beaten the best teams on its schedule. Yes, it lost a couple games it shouldn't have. Ohio State, however, has lost to the 2 best teams they played all year. They've really only played 2 top-level teams all year. Their schedule this year, left them who they played: Texas to start the season. Texas turned out to be a solid SEC team, but not a great team, right? But a 10-win team at the end of the year, so good for them. They played Grambling, Ohio, Washington, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Penn State, Purdue, UCLA, Rutgers, Michigan, Indiana, Miami. That's the run. And there at the end, they lost those back-to-back games. The best game they played in the regular season was either maybe Texas or Michigan or Washington. And none of those teams, all of those teams at best are mid-lower level top 25 teams. And so it seems like as they got to the end of the season here against Indiana, and while they were good enough to win either the games against Indiana or Miami, they seemed to have struggled. They bogged down. Their offense only put up 10 points in the one game and 14 points in the other. So 24 points in 2 games after being in the top 10 or 15 or 20 most of the year. Well, in the top 25 and offensively throughout the year. They're where were they actually? Let's go back and check. They were 24th in total offense and 17th in scoring offense. So they were averaging in the 30s and they were putting up nice points, but weren't able to do it against these higher level defenses. They just didn't have the output. And it just seems like they weren't prepared for that. In this game, Miami actually played a game very similar to the kind of game we would probably play against Ohio State had they advanced against and got to play against us. Miami held them to only 59 total plays. Miami had the ball for almost 34 minutes of the game in one time of possession. Ohio State actually outgained Miami in the game, but Miami was able to convert 50% of their third downs while holding Ohio State to just 3 of 10 on third down. And Miami also was able to create the pick six, which made obviously a huge difference. And they were also able to hold or push Ohio State into limited running of the ball. Ohio State ran the ball. Julian Sayin was sacked 5 times. If you take those sacks out of the equation, they only truly ran the ball 19 times in the game. And I think that could have been one of their problems. They did not commit, or they were not able to get enough production to stay within the run game. And of course, once you fall behind, that can be difficult. But the run game, Miami only, Carson Beck only threw for 138 yards and 1 touchdown. It was only a 5.3 per completion average, which is not, or attempt, 5.3 yard per attempt average, which is not an elite number anywhere close to it. But he did complete 70% of his passes. He managed the game well, and they were able to run the ball. Miami ran the ball 37 times for 153 yards, limited their negative yardage plays, whereas Miami's defense made a huge difference. They had the 5 sacks against Julian Sayin. They were all big sacks. They combined for minus 42 yards on the sack yardage, so almost a 9 yard per sack loss. So Ohio State found itself in a difficult situation. The interception return for touchdown was just a brutal play. The Miami guy saw the play the whole time, read it, cut right in front of the ball, and just took it to the house. And probably the play shouldn't have been called, although screen passes are called a lot by all teams these days and considered a safe pass, but Miami's defense was ready for that. And when pushed into obvious passing, Sayin was harassed the whole game. The Miami defensive line ate up the Ohio State offensive line. Again, they abandoned the run. And this is with Jeremiah Smith, maybe considered the best overall offensive player in football. This is with him still having a monster day. He had 7 catches, 57 yards, and a touchdown, a 22.4 yard per catch average. Sayin, if you take the 2 interceptions that he threw out of it, you look at it and you say he was 22 of 35, about 62%, 8.2 yard per attempt average, 287 yards. He was not terrible throughout the game, but he was under duress in the whole game, and the interception was a killer. In fact, if you take the pick 6 out of it, the score was 17-14, and Ohio State also missed a field goal right before the half. So had they made that field goal, it's basically an even game. So again, the pick 6 made all the difference. So, kudos to Miami. I mean, I think we all, everybody, look, as Georgia fans, we're in the category of facing the wrath of the nation out there. Oh no, there's Georgia again. Here they go again. Everybody gets tired of seeing the heavyweights win over and over. And certainly nobody wants to see Ohio State win over and over. They're not loved across the country in any special way. And they, as the reigning national champion and a team that went undefeated and number 1 through most of the regular season, everybody was looking to see them fail. And they did. But mostly, again, what I look at there and my takeaways are defensive games between these elite teams are going to make the difference, and who makes the mistakes. Ohio State missed a field goal, and Ohio State gave up the pick 6. And like I said, those points and differences are pretty much the difference in the game. Miami and Ohio, they basically had similar yardage. Everything else is pretty similar. The difference is, and Miami even had a fumble. Miami had a turnover. So Miami gave away, they were in probably surefire field goal range, or most likely surefire field goal range, and they gave away a fumble. So it's not like Miami didn't make any mistakes, but their fumble cost them a potential field goal. Ohio State's turnover led to 7 points for Miami in a defensive struggle in a game that was a 10-point game, and they missed a field goal as well that they had earned and got the yardage. So they put themselves in a hole. They dug out of it, once they got down 14-0, they drove the length of the field, 67 yards right before the half, missed that field goal. They took the ball to start the second half. This is Ohio State I'm talking about. They drove the length of the field, put up 70, 80 yards of offense, scored a touchdown. They stopped Miami, got the ball back, and did it again. Another 70, 80-yard drive, scored another touchdown. So they pulled within the 3 points that they didn't get right before the half. They had 3 nice long drives back-to-back, and they stuffed Miami in between. So they had the chance. They pulled themselves into a position where they could have taken back or put themselves back in control of the game. But ultimately, the missed field goal and the pick six proved to be too much to overcome. Miami was able to right the ship, get some points, get another score, stretch the lead out, put Ohio State in a desperation mode at the end where they threw a pick to seal it, and that's how the game went. So Miami will be a tough out. I mean, Miami will be tough to play, and I think the good news is, again, I think what I said about Miami after Texas A&M, I said about Georgia, I think it's true about most of the teams that are left now in this playoff, is if you can win in more than one way, and Georgia has been a team that has really shown that, right? Just talking about Ole Miss, the team we're going to play tonight. Last time we beat Ole Miss, we really needed to put up a ton of offense. We put up over 500 yards of offense. We scored over 40 points. We needed that to win the game because the defense struggled early in the game to contain Ole Miss, and ultimately we were able to win a shootout game. We won another shootout game earlier in the season against Tennessee. But we've since been able to win games even like the Georgia Tech game or the Alabama games that were a little bit more low-scoring affairs, more defensively oriented. So Georgia has shown that it can win a field position defensive-oriented game. Georgia has shown that it can win a shootout if it has to. So that's the kind of team that coming into this playoff gives you the kind of versatility to think, okay, well, maybe this is, in fact, a team that can win and compete for the national championship. And Miami, I think, looks like that kind of a team, too. They have now won a pair of defensive battles where their defense really won the day. Their offense did a little bit more in this game than against Texas A&M because, again, they had the 24 points as opposed to just 10. But still, you're not seeing 35-3 kind of scores here. These are pretty evenly matched games, and they look a little bit more like NFL games. Less overall possessions, less overall points, defense being more of a factor, and turnovers and mistakes being a factor. And that does seem to be the deal. Miami played a cleaner, better game, not mistake-free. A lot of people would have told you coming into the game for Miami to win, Carson Beck has to be nearly perfect. Tony, their freshman Malachi Tony, their freshman wide receiver / running back hybrid everything guy, would have to have an amazing game, and they would have to basically play a perfect game. Well, they did not play a perfect game. They fumbled the ball. Malachi Tony actually had 2 fumbles. Miami was able to recover both of them. But for the game, he had 5 catches, but only 16 yards. Was not a big factor in the game. Carson Beck was at one point had completed 13 straight passes in the first half, but he was mostly playing that manager role. Again, 70% completion, but only 138 yards total passing. And we've seen Gunnar Stockton have that game recently in the last couple games. So, Carson Beck played his role and he did what he had to do. And Fletcher, who had a big game, their running back against A&M, almost 200 yards or 180 something yards against A&M, had a nice game again, 19 carries, 90 yards, a 4.7 yard average. So he helped them grind out the clock, get those third down conversions, and hold on to the time of possession for almost 34 minutes in the game. So they're going to be tough. It'll be, I think, if we get to the game, the Miami-Georgia game, I think it's going to have a lot of intrigue. Obviously, the media is going to love the storylines. Carson Beck versus Gunnar Stockton, old quarterback, new quarterback. Carson Beck against his old team. Miami on the rise, after years of being down. Georgia, the big bad team who's been up, going for its 3rd national championship in 5 or 6 years. So, those are the storylines we're going to hear. So let's hope we get to that. couple other things real quick before we break down the game with Ole Miss. Just wanted to say, thus far hasn't been an awesome bowl season for the SEC. So far, we're 3-6. The SEC is in bowl games. The wins came in Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas. And the Alabama, that was a rematch of the Alabama-Oklahoma game from earlier in the season. And so that game it was always destined to be one SEC team would win and one SEC team would lose. So it was kind of a no-win or an all-win situation, depending on how you look at it there. But Alabama has one of those wins, and so we'll see if they're able to continue their postseason magic and take down the top seed Indiana today. And I'll just say, I think they have a fair chance. I mean, they have not played well offensively. The idea has been that Alabama has not played well down the stretch. That's not really true. I made this comment on the last podcast. Alabama has not played well offensively because they have been exposed. They have been really one-sided on their offense, just really a 70% passing team. And they have and I've said this, Kalen DeBoer, I've made this point before. Kalen DeBoer coming into the Alabama job, my concern when people ask me, do you think it's a good fit? I said from the get-go, my concern is this is a guy who doesn't create sort of the dominating games that Alabama fans are used to seeing from Nick Saban. This is a guy who kind of creates games that are pretty close, and he's going to make a gutsy call, maybe a silly call, as I might think. He's going to make some moves, make one more coaching pull of the strings than the other guy, and he's going to put the shoulder on his best players, usually his quarterbacks and wide receivers. And he's going to count on them in the key moment to make the big play to pull out the win. And that has worked well for him at lower level football and even in the Pac-12, the Pac-12 before it fell apart. Now the Pac-2, whatever. But when he was at Washington, that is a tougher way to win in the SEC because teams are so much more evenly matched and you have so much better talent. So you need to create some breathing room for yourself. You need to dominate games where you can. You need to be a little bit more forceful, and you need to be a little bit more multidimensional. But they have not had a very good running game. But that doesn't mean they haven't played well. In fact, the Alabama defense has played really well, and the more the offense has put them on the field more and not held on to the ball as much as they were early in the season and has become even more one-sided on its passing attack, the more the defense has had to do, and generally they have responded. So I think it's a misnomer to say Alabama hasn't played good football down the stretch. They have not played good offensive football down the stretch, and I think that it creates the problem for them. But that doesn't mean, just like Ole Miss, I'm saying Ole Miss is dangerous coming into the game against us. Alabama is dangerous. They certainly have the talent. In fact, they're probably the more talented team than Indiana. As good as Indiana has played, or as well as Indiana has played, over the last 2 seasons, they are still doing it with a lot of lower, smaller school guys that have stepped up and some 3-star kind of guys. Their overall talent index doesn't suggest that they are a top 5 or a top 10 team. Their talent index suggests they're maybe a top 25 or a top 30 team. On paper, Alabama, talent-wise, is still loaded with a roster that is a top 5, top 3 talented team. And so if they can get the right offense going, if they can keep Indiana off balance, if they can cover for the fact that their run game has not been very good, and they can pick apart the secondary a little bit for Indiana, hold on to the ball, try to limit Indiana's chances, then they could win this game. They certainly have the talent. They certainly have the line, the offensive and the defensive lines. There's nothing Indiana can do. But Indiana has been a very solid, the best overall statistical team in the country this year. So, I think that we have to respect the fact that Indiana, is still the favored team, and they are favored to win this game by 6.5 or 7 points, but Alabama has a good shot. So moving back on to just finishing up the idea about the SEC. So we have so far on the season, or on the bowl season, the SEC has put up a 3-6 record. The wins have come from Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas. Texas is done for the year, beat Michigan. So thankfully, we, as much as we beat on Texas, I'm happy that Texas has done the SEC proud. We really needed a win, and we did not need to see, I think it would have been embarrassing to see a premier program, and I think we have to admit that Texas is a premier program in the SEC, and they're certainly expected to be a premier program. That's how the rest of the country sees Texas, as one of the SEC's premier programs. So it would be embarrassing if Texas had it would embarrass the SEC if Texas had gone out on the season and bookended the season with losses to the two premier teams in the Big Ten. So Texas now assuming the role with Georgia, with Alabama, LSU, among the teams that are considered elite or premier SEC teams. If they started the season by losing to Ohio State and finished the season by losing to Michigan, then I just think that would have been an unsightly, unappealing way for us SEC fans to have to deal with the Big Ten and think about the Big Ten going into the offseason. So kudos to Texas in banking a win. Ole Miss got the win against Tulane. That was an overmatched playoff game that should never have been. And Alabama, like I said, got the win against Oklahoma, but Oklahoma could have got the win. Either way, we were going to get one win and one loss as the SEC in that matchup for the bowl season. Our losers, Texas A&M, obviously lost their first playoff game to Miami, who advanced and beat Ohio State. Missouri sadly lost to ACC runner-up Virginia, who had like an 11-win season. But Missouri, just a lot of talent, a lot of promise, but just wasn't able to deliver with all the changes at quarterback this year, I guess. I didn't see that game, but didn't come together well. LSU got into a bowl game despite their losing record because of the need to fill slots. Or actually, they didn't have a losing record. I take that back. But they were in the bowl game and they lost. So that's a little bit disappointing. They lost to Houston, a Big 12 team. Tennessee also embarrassing the SEC by losing to Illinois, a mid-level Big Ten team that was overhyped for much of the season. So very disappointing. I guess you could say in a battle of SEC versus Big Ten mid-level overhyped teams that were probably overranked at most at points of the season, when the two of them played each other, Illinois came out ahead and Tennessee lost. So that's a little embarrassing to the SEC. And then also in a game versus teams that are often not thought about that much, even when they had great seasons, like Vanderbilt and Ohio. Those two played, and Vanderbilt came out on the losing end, and Diego Pavia ends his career with another loss, although putting up a lot of yards and points in the game. So that's where we stand so far. Those are our losers and winners. We still have Ole Miss, Alabama, and Georgia in the game, but we have another SEC matchup today. Alabama, Georgia, as you well know. So one's going to win, one's going to lose. So that's not going to improve our overall record very much. So if we want to see the SEC do better overall, we need that to come on the heels of Alabama beating Indiana. That's the only way for the SEC to get a better look out of today, because either Ole Miss or Georgia are going to lose, and either Ole Miss or Georgia are going to win. So we're kind of stuck with that. So, all right, that's our rundown of where we are in the SEC so far. I don't know if that's very instructive or tells us much about what we're looking at. You know, I don't know if the comparative nature of those games and where we are tells us much, but you know, that's where we are so far. So, all right. So we talked a little about the playoff. We're down to these quarterfinal games. One of them's already in the books. We got 3 to go. They're going to be excellent games. I think the Oregon-Texas Tech game has a line of like 1.5, 2.5, and I think that's spot on. That just seems too close to call. And it's just hard to imagine what's going to happen. I don't think anybody's seen enough of either of those teams playing better teams, so it'll be interesting to see what happens when they play each other. Alabama-Indiana will be compelling because Indiana, I think, has earned enough respect this year with what they've done. Last year, they lost to the only 2 decent teams they played. Looked to be a little bit of their success seemed to be about having the schedule that they did. And, that this year they beat Oregon on the road. They beat Ohio State. Those are both legitimate top 10 teams. So I think we have to give them the respect. They still only played those 2 teams. So they had a pretty weak schedule otherwise along the way. So it'll be interesting to see. This is kind of a team that could have been better, but is disappointing in the SEC versus a team from the Big Ten that's super exceeding all expectations. And, everybody wants to see that story continue if you're not in the SEC or if you're not Alabama. People are excited about the underdog nature of Indiana, and they were the worst team in college football for the last 100 years, and now they could be winning the national championship. So they're certainly legit. Again, statistically speaking, I've talked before about how I've developed my own statistical metric, looking at statistics that helps me look a little bit about how powerful I think the teams really are, and maybe a little bit of predicting of who's going to win some games. Indiana has played the best football statistically across the board this country this season. No doubt about it. They are in the top 10 in every important category statistically that helps you win football games, and that is unusual. In fact, their average rank across all categories is like 3 or less. So that's pretty amazing to be that consistent across the board. Offense, defense, special teams, time of possession, you name it. So there's no doubt they played great football. But going back to Ohio State for a minute, I mentioned that I think Ohio State didn't have the advantage of really hardening themselves against a better schedule. The Big Ten, here's what I made this point in a previous podcast. Let me say this again. I think when you take the teams, and when I use other people's stats, or I use my own Daily Dog power stat metric, what I consistently see is that in leagues as big as the SEC with 16 teams and the Big Ten with 18 teams, is that the top of the league are pretty similar. Basically, if you take the SEC is 16 teams, so the top half is 8 teams. The Big Ten is 18 teams, the top half is 9 teams. If you take the top 8 teams of the SEC and the top 9 teams in the Big Ten, they pretty much have about the same rank. Those teams in my power metrics rank all. The average ranking is around 22 to 25 for both conferences. So they're pretty similar. This year, the Big Ten has been a little higher at the high end. The bottom of their top half is a little more average. The SEC has been more consistently top 20 across the top 8, the first 8 teams. The bottom of the SEC is also a lot better, and that's a big difference. And I think this is, again, where Ohio State was hurt a little bit. I looked at it, and in my metric, the Daily Dog Power Stat metric, Ohio State's 9 conference games, they played 6 of their 9 games were against the bottom 9 teams in the conference. And those bottom 9 teams their average rank, I think I had that, but I'll tell you. They average in terms of my power metric. So of the 134 teams that I ranked in FBS for the season, the average rank of the bottom 9 teams in the Big Ten was 90. They were 90th. The average rank of those teams is, statistically speaking, in 90. Whereas if you take the bottom 8 teams of the SEC, the average rank of those teams is 74. So they were significantly weaker, and Ohio State played 6 of their 9 conference games against those teams. They're, again, the best teams they played before they got to Indiana in the Big Ten championship game, and now Miami, was either Michigan or Washington or Texas, depending on how you look at it. So none of those were great teams. All of those were just pretty good teams. So I just don't think they were prepared. So hopefully for Georgia, preparation comes out to be a big deal. All right, so that's enough background. So we mentioned Texas Tech, Oregon. We mentioned Indiana, Ohio State. So the other game that is out there, and then that's us, right? And we already talked about Ohio State and stuff. So we're down to the last game. Last game is the nightcap, the final game of the quarterfinals, and that'll be Georgia versus Ole Miss. So as we talked about, this is a rematch, a game we've already seen this year, and it was one of the better games. A lot of people really enjoyed watching this game outside the SEC, around the country. This was a featured game because it was a top 10 matchup, and it was Lane Kiffin coming to Sanford Stadium, and Ole Miss was undefeated. Georgia had lost the game earlier to Alabama. And so there was a sense that maybe Ole Miss really has a chance. This is the best Ole Miss team in a while. And they came in and they acquitted themselves well. They played well. They led by 9 points, famously, going into the fourth quarter, and then ended up losing by 8 because Georgia had a 17-0 fourth quarter, in which they dominated, not just with the 17 points, but statistically held Ole Miss to, Ole Miss had 3 drives, and they went basically 3 and out, and then they gave the ball over on downs in a desperation attempt to keep the ball on a fourth down play. So Georgia, and that game was a turning point for Georgia, I think. When you look at that fourth quarter, with the defense all of a sudden was able to start getting pressure. That's what changed. There was very little pressure on Trinidad Chambliss earlier in the game. He was able to kind of run or pass or do what he wanted. And when we got them in the third downs, like we had seen earlier in the season against Alabama and like we had seen a few times, we were not able to get them off the field. They converted third downs, and they didn't just get into the red zone, they scored. And that was really the big difference. I think a little much was made of the idea that we were behind by 9 at one point. In reality, both teams had the ball 5 times, and both teams had scored 5 times. It's just that Ole Miss had been very efficient, and Georgia had not done enough defensively to force them into field goals or maybe a more desperation play. They were able to get touchdowns all 5 times they got near our side of the field. And so they started the game with 5 straight touchdowns. Georgia also started the game with 5 straight scores, but we settled for 2 field goals. And having already started falling behind in the point matchups, we went ahead and went for a 2-point conversion when we did score one of the touchdowns to try to get back in the right sequence on the points. And that didn't work either. So that's how we fell behind by 9 points. We gave away 4 points on the first field goal, 4 points on the next field goal. That's 8. And then the 2-point conversion failed. If we weren't chasing those points at that point, you just kick the extra point. That's 9 or 10 points that we could have had. That's how we were 9 or 10 points behind. But both teams had the ball the same amount of time. And since Georgia ended up scoring 8 straight times in that game when we got the ball next after. So in other words, that 9-point lead was also very short-lived. Ole Miss got the ball and scored, and they had been up by 2. They had been up 28-20 or 28-26. Then they score, and they get the 7 points, and now they're up by 9. And as soon as we got the ball back, we scored again and kicked the extra point, and then it was back to a 2-point game. So that 9-point lead only lasted as long as till the next time Georgia got the ball. So it wasn't like, they built a multi-score lead and held it for a while, and then eventually Georgia came back. No, it was we score, you score, we score, you score. They just were more efficient and made all of their scores touchdowns, and we settled for some field goals. So, but in the end, our defense rose up and did more. Their defense never stopped Georgia in the game. Georgia scored all 8 times it touched the ball. The last time it took a knee to end the game, but the 8 times that it had the ball and needed to score and tried to score, Georgia did. Whereas Ole Miss scored the first 5 times, but then the next 3 times they failed to score. Georgia kept scoring, and so all of a sudden you have that 17-point swing. A 9-point deficit becomes an 8-point win. So another thing that I think was really interesting about the Ole Miss game, looking at it statistically, Ole Miss actually had its worst game of the season statistically against Georgia, which is to say that offensively, they put up the least yards they put up in any game this season against Georgia. In fact, Georgia is the only team this season to hold Ole Miss under 400 yards of offense. So they're in the top 2 or 3 in the country. What was it? Coming into this game, Ole Miss in total offense, they're number 2. They're number 2 in the country in total offense. So that's yardage, and 10 in the country in scoring. So against us, they did score the 35 points. Again, super efficient. That was middle of the pack for them on the season. That was 7th of their 13 teams as far as how many points they scored. So other teams held them to less points than we did, which is a little sad. Our defense was not able to be super efficient against them, but our defense was able to yardage-wise, again, hold them to the least yards they had. They had 351 yards, and we held them to only 60 plays. They average about 72 to 74 plays a game. So we held them to about 60 plays, and we held the game was fairly even in a time of possession, or Georgia owned the time of possession. I'll have to go back and look at that. So again, this was the only game of the year they failed to get 400 or more yards. They actually had 600 a couple times, 500 a couple times, and then most of their games they've been in 400 yards. It was also statistically their worst game defensively in terms of only Arkansas put up more yards. Arkansas battled them to a 41-35 loss. We had a 43-35 win. So those games were actually kind of similar, both teams marching back and forth. But Arkansas put up 526 yards on 72 plays. Georgia put up 510 yards on 80 plays against Ole Miss. So those are the only two teams to go over 500 yards on the Ole Miss defense. The Ole Miss defense, as I pointed out, is much weaker statistically than the other teams that are in the playoff. But the Ole Miss defense as a unit compared to nationally, they are a top 30, top 35 overall defense. So they're an upper third, upper 25% in the country type of defense. And Georgia was able to create basically their biggest upside down differential of the season. They gave up, They gave up 510 yards while only generating 351 yards. So Georgia outgained Ole Miss by 159 yards on the game, which is actually more than Georgia's average for the season, which is more like in the 120s, 130s. So Georgia actually really statistically, and if you go back and you think about those points, if we had not settled for field goals, not chased the 2-point conversion because we were falling behind points-wise, at that point where we were actually behind by 9 points, we could have been tied. And as we moved ahead, or ultimately ended up winning, in other words, it could have easily been, we ended up winning by 8, but you start adding those points back in or make Georgia a little bit more efficient in the red zone. Statistically speaking, Georgia actually did enough. They could have won the game 48-35 if you just didn't kick the field goals and didn't go for a 2-point conversion that you didn't get. So, looking at the game, usually I do these breakdowns, as you know, through the season, and we go through the whole thing where we say, what are the true matchups? What are the true outcomes? Let's talk about the coaching. I don't know enough about Pete Golding. You all know what I know. Okay. Lane Kiffin left and is at LSU. The team has a chip on their shoulder. Nobody's looking favorably anymore right now at the Lane Kiffin era and like, oh, those were such good times. Woe is us. What are we going to do? There's much more of a chip on the shoulder attitude. Good riddance, good luck. We don't need you anyway. We got Pete Golding and we are super happy about it. And everybody's excited. They went out and had a big game and the Pete Golding era got started. They beat Tulane in the rematch playoff game. And of course they'd played Tulane earlier in the season. They beat them 45-10. They played them in the playoff at home, same venue. They won 41-10. I think we can pretty much say that Ole Miss is 31 to 35 points better than Tulane. We think we proved that. So thank you, playoff. But I don't know that there's that much different. Charlie Weiss, who's the offensive coordinator, Charlie Weiss Jr., who's Lane Kiffin's offensive coordinator, is going with him to LSU, but is come back or sticking around for this game. I don't know if that'll create a distraction, but long story short, on the coaching side, Pete Golding may turn out to be great, and I think he's probably pretty good. And I like the fact that he's a hometown. He's from Mississippi, and so for him, this is kind of a dream job. And I love that the school and everybody's rallying around, hey, good riddance to Lane Kiffin. If he didn't want to be here, we got a hometown son, and we're happy to have him, and he's happy to be here. And I think that's great, and I hope that attitude works well for them. And I hope they're successful every time other than tonight, in this game. So I have no real ill will for Ole Miss, but I don't see where they got better because they have a coach that's 1 foot in the door and 1 foot out the door calling plays for their offensive coordinator, and because they lost a coach that everybody in the country wanted and was willing to pay $100 million or more to come to their school. So I don't think and that's all apologies to Pete Golding. And he may turn out to be phenomenal. He may be the next great coach in waiting, and we just didn't know it. But I don't think they got better because Lane Kiffin went away. And I don't think they're better because their offensive coordinator's already got another job, and he's just doing this job until they lose. So, were they able to keep some continuity with these coaching changes? Yes, that's great because Pete Golding was already their defensive coordinator. Charlie Weiss Jr. was already their offensive coordinator, so they have some continuity. They have a chip on their shoulder. They already lost this game. It is a rematch, so that's always a bit scary. But Georgia's the better team. Georgia is the more complete team. Georgia can win an offensive shootout or a defensive slug, and Ole Miss's defense is talented and good relative, like I said, to being in the upper third of the country in defense. They are not at Georgia's level. So is their offense better than Georgia? Well, statistically, they've played better than Georgia on the season. But when the two teams played, Georgia's offense was able to make much more hay against Ole Miss's defense than Ole Miss's offense was against Georgia. While they did put up the 35 points, they did have to have a near perfect start. They did. And that's the other thing I'd look at and say, yeah, it's scary. They played really well. The other side of it is you could say, look, they played a near perfect start to the game and still lost. They scored 5 touchdowns on their first 5 drives and could not win the game. And part of that is they're too one-dimensional. They're too focused on their need to offensively beat you. Georgia can beat you with defense. Georgia can beat you with offense. Since the two teams have played, their stats are very similar. It's kind of the middle of the season for both teams. Ole Miss is basically the same statistically offensively. They're actually a little better defensively, but their schedule's also been noticeably weaker down the second half of the season. They played Tulane, Florida, Georgia State, Mississippi State. So they have not exactly played a murderer's row of teams down the stretch of the season. Well, actually, since playing Georgia, they played Oklahoma, so that's a good defensive team, and they won that game. And they gave up 26 points to Oklahoma, but they won that game 34-26, so they could score on a good defense. They had a tough game against South Carolina. They beat the Citadel. They had a close game against Florida. They beat Mississippi State, and then they had the Tulane game in the playoffs. So they have been only giving up 10 to 13 points on defense since we last played them, but they've also played a bunch of offensively challenged teams in that time frame. So on the season, they're giving up more like 17, 18, 19, or 19 points a season, 19 points a game. So Georgia, on the other hand, has really clamped down the stretch of the season. Down the stretch for Georgia has not allowed. Georgia gave up 322 yards. So since playing Ole Miss, we've played Florida, Mississippi State, Texas, Charlotte, Georgia Tech, and Alabama. We have only given up 300 yards once. The rest of those times, we've had 280, 274, 169, 250, 209. Now, that 169 is against Charlotte. Okay, throw that out. But 250 yards against Georgia Tech, which was a top 10 offense, 209 yards given up against Alabama, just dominating them defensively. Georgia's defense has just taken it to another level. On the season, they're only overall, say, 9th or 10th best defense in the country. But early in the season, they were just good. Second half of the season, they're elite. And only Mississippi State, who was one of the better offensive teams this season, put up over 300 yards. And really, most of that came, they had over 100 yards of offense in garbage time when they switched to the backup quarterback exclusively. And Georgia had been up 38-7. And at that point, when we started subbing liberally on defense and they subbed in on offense and they kept gunning, and there was a lot of time still on the clock, they were able to rack up 100, 125, 150 yards. They had been held to under 200 yards up to that point. So defensively speaking, even that game is really just a product of them having 68 plays because Georgia was up big with so much time still left on the clock. So that's kind of how that panned out. So that's a little bit of a breakdown of where we were since we last played. Lane Kiffin's gone, Pete Golding's in. We talked about the coaches. Georgia is actually scoring. The one concern you might have is Georgia's offense has been a lot less powerful seeming in these 5 games. Georgia's offense in those same 5 games I just talked about has only been averaging 381 yards a game, averaging scoring right about 31 points a game, whereas previously we'd been averaging the first 5 or the games before we played Ole Miss, we were averaging 416 yards a game of offense and about 32 points a game. So 32 points, 30 now, over 400 yards of offense, 380 last 5 games. That would be concerning. But again, Georgia's defense has been averaging, only giving up 250 yards in the game since we played Ole Miss. So our differential in those games, which is always important to me, before we played Ole Miss, our differential on the season was an average of 109. We were outgaining teams by 109 yards a game. But our offense may have taken a step back by about 30 yards a game in the second half of the season, but our defense has ratcheted up by more than 50. So the net result is Georgia's now beating teams in the yardage game by over 130 yards a game, and continues to be top 4, top 5 in time of possession and first downs and suppressing first downs. And overall, Georgia's third down, suppressing the other team's third down completions has just gotten better and better. For the whole season, Georgia's still not up to where it was, say, in 2021 or 2022, but it has been down this back half of the season. So both teams have played pretty similar to how they played coming into the last game, except for Georgia has been a lot better defensively, a little less powerful offensively. But I will also tell you, offensively, some of that comes back to the fact that we didn't need to be. Again, we were dominating those games defensively, like the Alabama game. We did not even rack up 300 yards of offense in the Alabama game, but we scored 28 points because we blocked a punt and scored short field. We returned an interception to midfield, scored from midfield. We had a punt return after forcing them to punt from their own end zone. We had a punt return that got us back to midfield or beyond. So we had multiple drives where we scored. And, of course, Alabama themselves went for the fourth down, the famous fourth down from their own 12-yard line, and gave us the ball there. So another touchdown on a 12-yard drive. So we scored like Ole Miss had been against us, we were very efficient offensively, but we did not need a lot of yardage, and we did not generate a lot of up and down the field. We did a lot of it with defense and special teams. So I think largely what you see very similar teams coming together as the last time we played. And if anything, Ole Miss is maybe more motivated and more excited. They want to prove themselves, although I think they wanted to prove themselves last time too. And last time they had Lane Kiffin coaching. So this time they have an interim offensive coordinator and a new coach. And he's this will only be his second game ever as a head coach. So it's a big experience. You talk about quarterbacks and how they play in a big game like this, in a big moment, not having experience. That might have been a factor for Julian Sayin. Carson Beck didn't light it up with big yardage yesterday, but he didn't make any mistakes like Julian Sayin did, where Julian Sayin threw the pick six. So, and that's the kind of thing we often think is true in these big games, that experience sometimes plays out when two high-level teams play each other, when all the marbles are at play. So it's true for the game. It's true for coaches. Look, coaches make mistakes. Coaches make bad choices, and they're more likely to do that when they are under duress and when they're experiencing these things coming at them, like drinking from a fire hose with so much coming at you in a playoff environment with everything on the line. And I think we've even seen that, in the early days. There was some discussion that Kirby Smart, in his first couple seasons, when he vaulted Georgia into those playoff positions and these opportunities to compete for a national championship and the SEC championship, the question was, had he done enough to, or was he making in-game mistakes? Was he making choices that people said, why would you do that? I don't understand that. And this season, Kirby Smart has been making masterful choices in-game, like fake punts and like making sure the block was on for the call against Alabama for the block punt. He's been doing the thing, going for fourth downs in key situations that propelled Georgia forward to win the game against Alabama or Texas. So, you can just see that there's a big difference between an experienced coach and a first-time coach. So they didn't get better. They may long-term be just fine, but they're not better because they got Pete Golding now and a part-time offensive coordinator. And they didn't otherwise change their team very much at all. And they may be a little hampered because Kewan Lacey, their top running back, who is one of the best running backs in the SEC this year, had a shoulder injury after the last game. Now, he's had 10 days to get ready. He might be fine. We'll see. But Georgia also comes in with some injury concerns. Gabe Harris is not going to play, and Drew Bobo is not going to play. We know that now. Gabe Harris has that mythical turf toe thing, and I call it mythical because it sounds like something that wouldn't be that big a deal. Ooh, turf toe, but guys seem to be sidelined for an entire season sometimes with turf toe. So this is a bummer. This is a bad deal for Georgia. Gabe Harris was part of that resurrected pass rush pressure that we've been getting on quarterbacks. And while he hasn't had a ton of sacks, he was a guy that we thought coming into the season was going to be possibly our leading pass rusher. And as the season went on, he developed into that guy that we were really counting on and providing a lot of pressure and making some big tackles for loss, even outside of just pressuring the quarterback. And so without him, we're not better without him, but a lot of the young guys have been part of the resurgence in the defense. And so they're just going to have to step up. And Tolliver had a nice game at center, or at least I don't remember that he did anything awesome, but what I can tell you is, and we talked about this in the previous podcast against Alabama, SEC championship game, I didn't notice that he did anything bad. I mean, we went the whole game and you didn't think about it. We played our game. I didn't notice a bunch of bad snaps. We weren't having trouble moving the ball. Basically we dominated the game against Alabama and we played with a backup center. So if we could do that against Alabama's defensive front, which is much better than Ole Miss's defensive front, then and Tolliver's had more time to settle in as the starter, more time to practice with Gunner and the other offensive linemen. The other offensive linemen all seem to be more healthy and our rotation seems to be going well. So I don't expect the Tolliver Drew Bobo thing to be that big of a deal. The Gabe Harris situation might be a bigger deal if we see we're having trouble getting pressure on there. So, but Colby Young may be back, and I'm not expecting Colby Young to be the difference maker, but another wide receiver option, a guy who's known for being a physical blocker and can get tough yards and is a tall, big-time receiver that you can lean on in key situations to help that the game doesn't have to all be on Zachariah Branch. Noah Thomas had started emerging after Colby Young was injured and out, but Noah Thomas was dealing with some back spasms and some problems coming down the stretch of the season. I'm not sure how healthy he is, although he has been practicing from what I understand. So look, we're going to be better off if we have both Colby Young and Noah Thomas available in that sort of tall receiver position. So I guess, I'm just going to jump to it. I mean, we know what the outcomes are. The outcomes are Georgia blows them out, Ole Miss blows Georgia out. It's a close game either way. I think obviously I don't see Ole Miss blowing Georgia out. I just don't see that happening. We're playing too well. Defense is playing too well. Our offense might struggle. Ole Miss's defense is good enough to make trouble for our offense, and our offense has not looked as crisp in the last couple games as it had in the first half of the season. So this would be a nice time to see the offense come out and really establish itself, especially going up against, in the next game, such a big opponent defensively like Miami, who has really won its last two games on defense alone, just about. So it'd be nice to get the offense going. This is a good chance to do that, I think. But I don't see Ole Miss blowing us out. I think Georgia could win this game in a blowout. I think Georgia could, like I said, Ole Miss had to play almost perfect to stay within the 8 points last time, is another way of looking at the close game. And I think that this time around, Georgia could get some of those breaks. Georgia might not settle for field goals. Ole Miss might not score on every drive. And if that's the case, Georgia could win a game that looks like 48-28 or 45-21. That wouldn't surprise me. But I think the more likely scenario is that Georgia consistently harasses Ole Miss off. I think it's going to be sort of every other kind of drive kind of thing. I think Ole Miss will score, then they'll struggle, then they'll score, then they'll struggle. And I think Georgia will just do what it's been doing this season, possess the ball, methodically grind through yards, methodically put yards and points up. And so I think something more like on the low side, 28-17. We only scored 28 points and they are able to score 17. So it's a 11-point win. I think on the low side, that's where I see it. I think the middle makes a lot of sense to me, like 31-17. Georgia just kind of keeps grinding it out and putting it away. Maybe 35-14 is still a grinded out kind of score. If Georgia just gets all the momentum offensively and the defense starts out like a house on fire, then yeah, it could be a blowout. It could be a 45-21 kind of game, or 40, maybe 38-13. It could go that way. But generally, I think Ole Miss, their offense is, look, they're number 2 in the nation in total offense, number 10 in scoring 37, 38 points a game. So if you can hold them to 17 points and 350 yards, you've won. You've held them to less than half of their production normally. So that would be a victory, even if it was not as good as Georgia has done defensively these last couple games. But let's be honest, we haven't played a team as good as Ole Miss in those last several games. So Mississippi State was really good. and they ultimately put up 21 points and 322 yards. Texas has shown that they have definitely improved. Everybody they've played other than Georgia, they've been able to put up 30 or more points in their last 5 or 6 games. Georgia's able to hold them to 10 points and only 274 yards. So, but I think Ole Miss is probably a better offense still than Texas. So Alabama's a little one-sided, and Georgia Tech's the best overall offense that Georgia played and just shut down. Held them to 9 points, only 250 yards. So it's possible. But, the main thing I guess we need to see is we hope that this layoff thing doesn't continue. I mean, the downside of watching Ohio State lose was that it continues this trend that the team that's had the long layoff versus the team that played in the first round has lost now 5 games in a row. So with Ohio State losing yesterday. So hopefully maybe that trend will be broken before we get to our game. There's 2 games to be played tonight. So we'll see. Maybe Alabama. Well, if Alabama beats Indiana, that would continue the trend. That's the 4 o'clock game. So this noon game coming up with Texas Tech and Oregon, if Texas Tech comes on to be the team that a lot of people thought they could be, and they actually take down Oregon, then maybe that'll be our first sign that, hey, a team that had to bye can actually win. So we'll see. I think Georgia can, and I think Georgia will. I think Georgia is the better team. I think Georgia and Indiana are the 2 best teams left, and the 2 most likely teams to win this playoff. I think Georgia, Indiana is the most likely playoff scenario. Although, again, it's almost a pick 'em between Indiana, Oregon, and Texas Tech. I haven't seen enough of them play other teams. I've only seen them play in their conference. And a couple of the, like the playoff, like I watched Texas Tech BYU, and I watched Oregon play Indiana earlier in the season. I watched Oregon play one other game this year. I can't remember what it was. And then I've seen Indiana play the Penn State game. I saw Indiana play Ohio State. I don't know. I can't tell without better comparison. It's so much better when they play games out of their conference. So my gut is they're all solidly top 10 teams, all teams that are legitimate threats to win the national championship, probably in descending order of Indiana, Oregon, Texas Tech. That's kind of how I'd rate that. So I don't know. We'll have to see. On our side of the bracket now, Miami's already in position, so we need to beat Ole Miss, and then it's us and Miami. And again, I like our chances against anybody, including Miami, but that's going to be a tough game. So you got nothing but tough games left. So now we're at the point where this is really compelling and really exciting. So, generally I can't, for my overall pick, I guess I'll close by what am I picking for the whole thing? I'm picking Georgia. I mean, why wouldn't I? I can't not, right? I mean, I want to be the most impartial analyst I can when it comes to this. But look, I am a Georgia fan, and this is a Georgia podcast, right? Look around behind me here if you're looking on video. So I am not hiding that. I am trying to be a guy who pays attention and learns and knows the whole field and can tell you useful information about all of college football. But I can never get past the fact that when you get down to what to me looks, now look, in the years where we were clearly a lesser team than some of the other teams, I might have hoped, but when I saw what we were, I would admit it and say no. So I didn't walk around in years where we were 8-4 or even 10-2, but outside the net and say, well, we could have won the national title. I mean, maybe actually some of those 10-2 years, because we've had that discussion, but because maybe a play here and a play there was the difference. But I mean, a lot of those 9-3 and 8-4 teams were not just, bad luck. And I didn't look at every game saying, well, we could have been a national champion. This team is good enough. I've been saying it all year. Is it, that's the question of the whole season. Is the team becoming good enough to be a national champion? And the answer we've had on the season is absolutely. How do we stack up against the rest of the field? We're as good as anybody on this field. We're as complete a team. We've got offensive weapons. We've got defensive weapons. The names and the people that we talked about emerging, stars have emerged. Gunnar Stockton's become a star. CJ Allen has become a star. Ellis Robinson is becoming a star right before our eyes on defense. On offense, Frazier has continued to be an excellent running back. Other guys like Noah Thomas and Colby Young had emerged, and Zachariah Branch at wide receiver. The tight ends have had a resurgent year this season. Offensive line, took some time to come together. They're very young, but they're obviously living up to their rankings and their recruiting rankings because they are very talented and they are just starting to take over and dominate games. So the pieces are there. We can win this. We can win this national championship. And there's just no reason I would pick against, especially, I don't know for sure if we would have, I think we could have competed against Ohio State, but I think that they were clearly on our level talent-wise across the board. Is Miami? I'm not sure. Miami is very talented, and they've got enough pieces, but I don't know if they're as talented. So if you put our team together and their team together, and they both play their nearly best game, I got to feel like Georgia's still going to come out ahead. And Indiana, same thing. Indiana is playing above their talent level, but they are playing with precision and coaching excellence and with just a togetherness, obviously. You don't play as well as they are without doing that. Oregon, Texas Tech, I have less to say. We'll know more after we see them play today. So I still think the most likely scenario is Georgia, Indiana in the championship game, and Georgia wins. Third national championship in 5 years. Super exciting. Definitely cementing our place not only in the college, both in the SEC and the college football world as the current king and dynasty of college football. And I know nobody wants to see that outside of us and SEC homers. Everybody wants to see the big Indiana story. But we'll get some compelling stories if that's what happens. We'll have the whole big Carson Beck, UGA, Gunnar Stockton discussion if we get through Ole Miss today. We'll have a week of that, and then we get through that, and then we'll have about 10 days to, ooh and ah over possibly the big blue blood, 2 times in the last 5-year national champion versus the team that's never won anything. And, obviously the whole country will be pulling for them. So, but you know what? I've been on that side of pulling against the big bad Alabamas and Dukes and not Duke. I actually like Duke in basketball, but anyway, you get my point. And speaking of basketball, let me just throw a quick shout out to the UJ basketball team, men's basketball team, women's basketball team's doing well too, I think, but I don't have as much detail. Men's basketball team ranked 23rd in the country, been in the rankings 2 weeks in a row, came in at 25, then moved up to 23, 12-1 on the season, got a first conference game. They've been through now they're done with their non-conference schedule, which wasn't the strongest, wasn't the weakest. They did some good things. They've been noticed by the people out there. They are firmly in a 7-8 seed kind of position in the bracket, early bracket thinking for the SEC or for the NCAA tournament, and they start conference play against Auburn, who's been one of the big boys in the SEC. But Georgia would be favored in this game right now. Georgia's had a better season so far, and Auburn's going through some transition. So, congratulations to Mike White and the men's basketball team. They have put a fun product out there. They are They are leading the nation and scoring nearly 100 points a game. They were at 99 point whatever. Now it's just 99, but they are consistently lighting up the scoreboard, and they've got a bunch of guys who can pour the ball into the hoop. And so I recommend you get behind the men's basketball team and get excited about that. This should be a fun season. I don't know that they're, again, national championship level, but right now they project. And look, we're on the up and up. We made the tournament last year. We played well. We beat a lot of good teams, got into the 20-win category. This year, we have a really good shot at exceeding that 20 wins and doing a little bit better, having a little bit higher seed and making more inroads. So progress being made. Congratulations to Mike White and the men's basketball team. And that's a product worth watching. So back to today, it's time to go out and get ready for tonight's game, Georgia versus Ole Miss. I think Georgia wins this game probably by 2 scores. I think that's the most likely outcome. I think Georgia grinds it out. Like I said, I think it kind of goes back and forth and back and forth. Georgia kind of consistently getting a little better of the game, and then ultimately comes out with a 2-score or better win. I think Georgia could, and I hope they do. I hope that they have practiced, and I know Kirby talked about they scrimmaged. I know they've been looking for ways to deal with the layoff. I hope they come out and they bust the layoff curse here, and they play like they've been playing down the stretch. If they play like they've been playing the last 5 or 6 games, the second half of the season, I don't think Ole Miss has much of a chance, and Georgia could easily win by a much bigger score than the last time, maybe even a blowout. So then we'll have plenty of time to talk about the matchup with Miami, if that's what happens. If it doesn't happen, then we'll have some time to cry and waller and wonder what happened and what could have been, because I do think we are in a position, and just having Ohio State out of the way doesn't make it great. Because again, I'm telling you, this Miami team is tough and legit. I saw that matchup, and I wish I'd come on and made a big deal about it on podcast so I could be one of the people who say, hey, I thought Miami might win that game. I don't know if I would have come out and said, I think they're going to win that game. But I would have squarely told you, if I'd had more time to talk about it before, that I think Miami definitely could. I thought it was one of the more intriguing matchups, and I was surprised that the line was as big as it was. Georgia, still holding at about 6.5-point favorite. It's been that way the whole time on this game. ESPN's predictive model says Georgia has about a 60% chance to win, but Ohio State had an over 70% chance to win their game, according to the same model. So who knows, right? Either way, it should be a lot of fun. We get to watch football all day and then have the nightcap with Georgia, and hopefully it comes off in another big victory and we move on in the playoff, and we are just all happily looking at one another and saying, "Go Dogs."